There's a very specific kind of productivity that exists entirely in your head. It's quite impressive, honestly. In the span of about 11 minutes, usually while walking or showering or pretending to listen to a podcast, you can reorganize your entire life. You suddenly understand exactly what the problem has been. The conversation becomes clear. The future becomes clear. There's a new routine now, a calmer version of you. Someone who answers emails immediately and probably owns glass containers for food storage. And for a brief moment, this feels extremely real. You leave the shower with the emotional clarity of someone who has changed. Nothing has technically happened, of course. You're still standing in the same bathroom, wrapped in the same towel, but mentally, tremendous progress. The strange thing is how satisfying this can become. A conversation gets rehearsed enough times that it starts feeling like you've already had it. You imagine leaving your job so vividly, you begin emotionally adjusting to a city you don't live in. Entire versions of your future develop this strange cinematic quality to them. Little scenes, tiny details, the sort of lighting that suggests your life has finally become aesthetically coherent. And because the brain is apparently very committed to the bit, it often struggles to distinguish between progress and imagination. Which is why people can spend months feeling emotionally exhausted by decisions they technically haven't made yet. You see this everywhere now. Someone says they're thinking about moving, but the way they describe the apartment, the neighborhood, the version of themselves who lives there, you realize they've already been there mentally for 6 months. Other people are considering career changes with the intensity of military strategists. They've built entire internal documentaries around what their new life would look like. There's a soundtrack, personal growth, and at some point there's usually a really great farmer's market. And honestly, I understand it completely. Because thinking has become a strangely convincing substitute for doing. Not intentionally. Most people aren't lying to themselves exactly. It's just that the internal version of things can become so detailed that it begins to carry the emotional weight of reality. And the really dangerous part is that sometimes this internal world is genuinely useful. Problems do get solved there, connections appear, certain decisions become obvious long before they're acted on. But at some point, a slightly awkward gap begins to emerge between the life that exists vividly in your head and the one that continues behaving very literally around you. I think part of the reason this happens is because thinking is clean. Reality, unfortunately, has texture. In your head, everything connects very elegantly. Decisions arrive with perfect timing. Problems resolve themselves during walks. Entire futures assemble themselves while you're cutting vegetables or ignoring a text message you absolutely should have answered 3 days ago. Real life is much less coordinated, because the second something leaves your head, it collides with logistics, timing, other people, money, energy levels. The fact that your life-changing morning routine suddenly feels less spiritually transformative when you slept 4 hours and someone from accounting has emailed you just circling back for the 5th time. And I noticed this most clearly while working on my latest short film. Not while writing it, interestingly. Writing still belonged to that internal world a little bit. The film could remain atmospheric there, suggestive, full of unresolved potential. But then it reached the point where it had to become real enough for other people to see, which is where things started getting significantly less mystical. Because once something has to exist outside your own head, you begin discovering how many parts were never actually resolved. The film wasn't just a film anymore. It was suddenly locations, pacing, references, visual tone, shot structure, transitions, scenes that worked emotionally but not practically, and other scenes that worked practically but now seemed determined to ruin the emotional rhythm of the entire thing. Which, creatively, is very exciting. Neurologically, slightly hostile. So while working through pre-production, I started building the film out in Milanote. Mostly because I needed to see everything at once. I realized very quickly that I could no longer keep the whole thing in separate mental compartments, because the strange part about filmmaking, and honestly most complicated things, is that everything starts affecting everything else. A reference image changes a scene, a location changes the dialogue. You move one sequence and suddenly the ending starts behaving differently for reasons no one can fully explain without sounding mildly unwell. Not just the script itself, but the world around it. Visual references, scene structures, notes, shot ideas, color palettes, location images, pacing, all the small pieces that start shaping the thing long before a camera is ever turned on. I started separating different parts of the film into columns and nested boards almost immediately. mostly because every section of the project kept generating smaller sections inside it. References linked out to other references. One location opened an entirely different visual direction. A scene that looked simple at first suddenly required its own miniature ecosystem of notes, images, pacing ideas, and shot structures. And what I liked very quickly was that the film stopped feeling trapped inside one linear document. It became spatial. I could move between the larger structure of the film and the smaller details without losing the thread completely, which was important, because every time I thought a scene was resolved, it revealed 6 newer, stranger decisions hiding underneath it. So the process became much less about organizing in the traditional sense, and more about being able to follow connections as the film evolved. Because once everything was visible at the same time, patterns started appearing that I genuinely don't think I would have noticed otherwise. If you'd like to explore it for your own project, you can sign up to Milanote for free through the link in my description. I think this is also why certain decisions become dramatically easier the second they leave your head. Not easier emotionally, unfortunately, just clearer. Because internally, everything tends to exist at the same level of importance. A passing thought sits beside an actual solution with identical confidence. Your brain presents all information like an overcommitted group chat where everyone believes they should be speaking first. But once things become visible, hierarchy appears. You start noticing what actually belongs together. What was carrying the emotional weight of a scene versus what was just there because you liked it aesthetically. Which ideas are connected and which ones were only pretending to be connected because they arrived at the same time. I found myself using Milanote almost less like a planning tool and more like a way of thinking spatially. Entire sections of the film started shifting once I could physically move scenes around and see how they interacted with each other. I'd rearrange sequences, pin references beside scenes, change color swatches for different emotional tones, and suddenly realize 2 moments that seemed unrelated were actually solving the same problem. Which sounds slightly dramatic when said out loud, but this is genuinely how creative work behaves once it becomes tangible. Nothing stays isolated for very long. And I think that's the part people often underestimate about making anything. Whether it's a film, a project, a business, a major life decision, once it exists externally, it starts revealing relationships you couldn't fully see while everything was compressed into thought. You realize the problem wasn't necessarily confusion, it was scale. Your brain was trying to hold too many moving parts at the same time while also attempting to convince you this was manageable. Which, to be fair, is a very ambitious thing for a brain to attempt. So a lot of my pre-production process became less about figuring the film out and more about building an environment where the film could start responding to itself. The notes connected to references, references connected to scenes, scenes connected to entirely different boards once the structure evolved. And because Milanote lets you build all of that visually, instead of burying everything across disconnected documents and folders, the process stayed fluid even as the film became more complex. And I think this is true far beyond filmmaking, because there's a very big difference between imagining something and constructing it. Imagining remained loyal to you. It protects the mood of things. It keeps the version of your future that feels flattering, coherent, emotionally satisfying. Nothing has to survive scrutiny there. A plan can remain beautiful indefinitely as long as it never encounters specificity. Reality is less sentimental. The second something becomes tangible, it starts answering back. A vague idea suddenly needs structure. A decision now affects other decisions. Things that felt emotionally convincing in your head become slightly harder to defend once they're sitting in front of you in actual visible form. And honestly, I think this is why so many things remain vague for so long. Vagueness is protective. A life you might change can remain perfect indefinitely. A project you want to start never risks becoming disappointing. An imagined future never has to confront logistics, timing, other people, budget constraints, or the deeply humbling experience of realizing your brilliant idea now requires 12 separate spreadsheets and an email thread that's longer than a CVS receipt. Specificity changes the relationship entirely. Because once something becomes visible, really visible, you can no longer interact with it as fantasy alone. Now it has shape, now it has consequences. It can fail, succeed, evolve, collapse, improve, which is significantly more vulnerable than simply thinking about it forever. But I also think it's the point where things finally become alive. Not perfect or even especially graceful. Real. And there's something so strangely relieving about that. Because once things become tangible, you stop needing to carry every version of them internally all at once. The idea no longer has to remain frozen in its most idealized form. It can change, respond, it can become something more specific than the vague, perfect version that existed privately in your imagination. Which, ironically, is usually where better things start emerging anyway. I think this is maybe the uncomfortable trade hidden inside most meaningful things. The imagined version remains untouched, elegant, coherent, immune to friction, but the real version becomes unpredictable almost immediately. Other people can see it now. It can disappoint you, change its shape. It can become messier than you intended, sometimes better, sometimes stranger, usually both. And yet, I don't think people actually want a perfectly imagined life. I think they want one that feels lived in. One that has evidence of contact with reality, decisions that were actually made, conversations that were finally had, things that moved beyond the internal draft stage and entered the world slightly unfinished, slightly vulnerable, but real enough to affect something. Because at a certain point, the goal stops being to imagine your life perfectly. You just want it to exist.